Hello, lovelies. You're listening to episode 22 of the Broken Enchantments podcast, written and read by Elizabeth Wheatley. That's me. I hope you enjoy this episode, and I would love to connect with you on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram. You can check out the links below. Now let's get to the story. There were few times in her life when Janir had been this sore. Riding for days had taken its toll, and she had achy muscles she hadn't even known existed. Carlisle slumped like a rag doll against her back. Saaradan's pristine white and Janir's tall bay plodded along wearily. They had been able to recover the animals in Avonport. Thanks to a generous merchant vessel, they'd only taken a few days to get back to the mainland, else things might have played out quite different. Colbo had been in an inn stable with money given to assure he was looked after, but Laristi had been a bit harder to find. Saaradan hadn't seen a need at the time to stable her, and she had been in the possession of a horse trader who claimed he'd found her wandering in the streets. After a bit of bartering and threats, Saaradan managed to get his prize steed back for nothing more than a small fee plus the costs of lodging her. The riders crested to the top of a ridge to find themselves abruptly overlooking the capital of Brevia. Saaradan was a grey stone maze of humble peasant dwellings, finer merchants' houses, and grand mansions for the wealthy, all surrounding the king's palace at the center of the city. Lights flickered along the outer walls and from countless windows. There must have been a bustle, even at the late hour, but from this distance all was quiet. Only the low bleating of a sheep flock on the other side of the hill sounded with the crickets and nighttime insects. "Midsummer's Eve is tomorrow," Janir noted, looking up at the clear, starry sky. Saaradan nodded. "That it is." He clicked his tongue, and his mare set off in a walk toward the labyrinth of Saaradan. Midsummer had always been Janir's favorite time. The bonfires, the dancing, the singing, the stories. She'd always gone down to play with the village children on those nights, and they had welcomed her into their ranks with open arms and smiles. Mothers and grandmothers, fathers and grandfathers, had all patted her on the head and gifted her with candied apples. These past few years, the sons of better-off merchants had started giving her flowers, which had not amused Armandius in the least. The daughter of a high lord, even the illegitimate one they thought her to be, was far above their station. He had always made a point of being home on such occasions so that he could lead the ritual prayers and dance with his daughter in sight of his subjects, and probably keep an eye on those who passed her summer blossoms. Not that Janir had much cared for any of those boys. It flattered her to no end if she was honest with herself, but in her heart she feared what would happen if she married. Her children would be Argotolums just as she was, and she wouldn't wish that on anyone. Certainly not in Brevia. Janir steered Colbo after Saaradan and Laristi, trying to set her mind on happier thoughts. She had survived 3 months of living the stuff of fireside fables, and was now about to reach Saaradan, where, according to the news that they had been able to pick up from town gossips, Armandius was still waiting. Their little group reached the city gates less than an hour later. The way was barred by a pair of massive doors, carved from the mightiest cedars and crisscrossed with steel bearings, closed and barred for the night. Staring up at the top of the battlements gave Janir a kink in her neck. At this hour of the night, when the darkness magnified and glorified the sheer strength of the walls, Janir found it hard to imagine the city could have fallen to the Slavish and Argotolums less than 2 decades before. "Open the gates!" Saaradan cried at the top of his lungs. When that didn't get a response, he shouted again, even louder. "Gates!" "It's closed for the night," growled a gruff guard from atop the wall. Only a glowering lump of shadow to Janir's eyes. "Who are you that we should open it?" "Saaradan, son of Velasquez Camlin, of the Sylvan Forests, with 2 companions," the elf shouted back.
An elf?
Yes, Saaradan answered. I am.
At this late hour?
We have been traveling for many days. We have business at the palace. Magical business. That was arguably true. At the mention of magic, Janir could see the guard shift.
Magic?
Yes. Saaradan had a calm, easy way of addressing the man that made Janir think he had done this many times before.
Where are you going?
The guard pressed. To the Grand Palace, the third wing. The guard didn't reply, but his lumpy outline disappeared from the top of the wall. And several moments later there was a creaking sound as the night watchman opened the gates. The elf led the way, riding under the raised portcullis. Janir followed on board Kalbo, nudging the stallion into a trot to keep up with the others. Carlisle stirred, but seemed by all appearances asleep. A few stray cats prowled the shadows. An occasional dog barked at the horses. Light, music, and rowdy laughter spilled out from the taverns, yet the clopping of the horses' hooves still seemed sacrilege to the stillness of the night. Somewhere within the city, the Enchanter Temple protected the country's most prized valuables, those gifted with magic. Enchanters, clairvoyants, seers, and their ilk were cloistered away safely from the rest of the world, learning to use their gifts for the greater good of the kingdom. Off in the distance, Janir thought she could sense their power. It was a steady, gentle glow that beckoned from the north of the city. She was still not used to this new awareness, this sensing of magic. In the chamber of automatons, she had seen everything, known every scrap of magic within reach. After, the sense had gone away, but it had gradually returned. Saaradan was a warm, dappled pattern before her, flickering and alive. He was the sun through leafy treetops, rays reflecting off a brook. Carlisle was a candle at her back, dim and yet constant. As they delved deeper into the city, she sensed more and more power, veins of magic running beneath their feet, over their heads. Veins of magic running beneath their feet, over their heads, webs of enchantment at random points. She couldn't have said what the spells were for or how they were created, but she could feel their steady presence. Rather than approaching the main gate of the palace, Saaradan took them to one of the more modest gates. After awakening an unsympathetic porter, coaxing him for a few minutes, and gaining entrance to a cramped courtyard, they were asked to wait until one of the minor stewards for this wing of the castle could be summoned. Janir could see no end to the royal castle from here. It seemed to go on forever, dwarfing Castle Caerson, which had once seemed so large. How many wings does this palace have?
Not enough to fly with,
Carlisle muttered, coming awake. 7. Saaradan kept his attention on the guards overhead. One in honor of each of the ruling houses. One in honor of each of the ruling houses. 2 stable boys staggered into the courtyard and took their horses. Janir was loath to watch Kalbo led away after she had very nearly lost him several times in the last few months, but he was better off with a soft stable floor under his hooves. The steward took nearly 20 minutes to appear as they waited in a small anteroom. Carlisle dozed, leaning against the wall. Janir sat with her arms wrapped around her knees. Saaradan must have been on the verge of collapsing as she was, but he was doing a splendid job of hiding it. Saaradan had said he had taken an oath to see her safely back to Armandius, and he took that oath very, very seriously. The anteroom was probably normally used by the servants, judging by the rugged make of the table and 4 chairs gathered around it. That was probably why Saaradan had chosen it, less likely to draw attention. The steward showed himself at long last. He was an older man, gray hair clumped to one side, robe haphazard, as if it had been thrown on in a blustery haste. The steward glared at all 3 of them as if they had arrived at this hour with the sole purpose of annoying him.
What do you want?
The steward demanded, speaking in the stuffy voice of a man just dragged from his pillows. Saaradan let the man's rude greeting pass, and went straight to business. I apologize that we had to wake you. But I have a message for the High Lord Armandius Caerson. He is here, is he not?
Aye, he is here, but I imagine that he's sleeping. Is that not what decent folk are doing at this unholy hour?
Then I am afraid that you will have to wake him. In the face of impertinence, Saaradan was nothing but courteous, nothing but calm.
High Lords tend to not like being awakened after midnight, the steward snapped. Much like their servants.
He will want to be awakened for this, was Saaradan's even reply. The steward grumbled under his breath. Janir doubted that it was anything she wanted to hear.
And who should I say is to blame for this very late message?
Tell him that Saaradan Camlin is here and that she is with me.
She? That's it?
That is all. Tell him exactly that. The steward must have been too irritated to be intrigued by the mystery. He ambled away, grumbling about arrogant elves with nothing better to do than wake up honest working men in the middle of the night. After the steward left, Janir found the courage to speak. Saaradan? The elf cocked his head in her direction. Thank you. For everything. A smile curled the corners of his mouth. You need not thank me. I was keeping a promise. I know, but few people would have done as much as you have, and I'm indebted to you. Janir felt awkward saying it, but she owed him far more. He'd protected her, defended her, even after he learned who she was, who she really was. That meant more to Janir than words could express. It was nothing. No, it really was. Janir didn't know what else to say, and Saaradan seemed to think it best not to respond. Rapid boot steps broke the awkward silence. Hearing a familiar voice, Janir bolted to her feet. Her foster father nearly threw the door off its hinges. He spotted Saaradan standing to the front of the room, but gave the elf only a cursory glance as he caught sight of Janir. Armandius was in his day clothes, but they were rumpled. Had he been sleeping in them? Janir thought she could see new lines of worry etched into his forehead, but she couldn't be sure in the light of the lone lantern. She threw her arms around his neck and buried her face in his shoulder as he swept her off the ground and spun her around twice. Are you all right? Armandius affectionately fingered her hair, looking her over from head to foot. She was in a badly fitted dress and second-hand shoes obtained in Avonport with more cuts and bruises than she cared to count, but Janir nodded. Yes, father. Thanks to Saaradan. Father. She called him that for years, even though they both knew it wasn't true. But as time went on, it had begun to feel true. He loved her, protected her, taught her, and told her he was proud of her. He was more Janir's father than the man who had begotten her. Armandius kissed her forehead and hugged her again. Then I am eternally in his debt.
What about me?
Carlisle tended to come awake at the most inconvenient of times.
You people give the elf all the credit?
Who is this? Armandius was too overjoyed at the safe return of his foster daughter to be truly angry, but he could hardly be impressed with the enchanter's speech. The enchanter unabashedly introduced himself.
Carlisle Kerwin, enchanter of the first degree.
Kerwin, as in the son of Marcerian Kerwin.
Well, yes, Lord Caerson.
Carlisle bowed awkwardly and squirmed uncomfortably at the mention of the name.
How do you know?
Sir Marcerian has been here for weeks to see if you'd turn up at the Enchanter Temple.
Daz here?
Carlisle gave a hard swallow. Recently awakened members of the castle staff appeared to coax the enchanter into his family's suite. Armandius went with Janir to the chambers she would be staying in for now. Her foster father kept an arm around her as they walked, as if he needed to assure himself that she was back and safe. As the pair rounded a bend in the hall, following after a grumpy servant, Janir glanced back to see Saaradan, weary and by himself. She hesitated, feeling that there was something she should do or say, but he just nodded in the direction of Armandius with a tired smile. Janir obeyed and didn't look back again. This has been the Broken Enchantments podcast. Thank you for listening. Check out my Patreon for early access to episodes, bonus content, and lots of patrons-only freebies. You can learn more at elizabethwheatley.com. And don't forget to subscribe. See you next time.